Corrupt cops celebrate in court, but freeze when she reveals she's the CIA director. Welcome to Tales by Ezra. Let's uncover what really happened. They say that still waters run deep, and perhaps nowhere is that adage more potent than when observing human beings. We are, by nature, quick to judge, to categorize, to place individuals into neat little boxes based on the most superficial of glances, their clothes, their car, the quietness of their voice, or the unassuming nature of their presence. But how often do those initial assessments, those snap judgments, prove to be profoundly, even dangerously wrong? How often does the quietest person in a room hold the most astonishing strength, the most formidable skills, the most unshakable integrity? Today, we delve into a story that peels back the veneer of outward appearances to reveal the extraordinary power that can lie hidden within, a testament to the fact that true authority and capability often were the most unassuming disguises. It's a story of arrogance challenged, of corruption unmasked, and of a vindication so profound it reshaped an entire community. It's the story of Elara Vance, and the day the small town of Pine Creek learned that some secrets are best left undisturbed, especially when the keeper of those secrets has the power to bring empires, or at least corrupt little fiefdoms, to their knees. Imagine, if you will, a woman arriving in a town not unlike many you might know, seeking nothing more than a little peace, a little anonymity. But what happens when that quiet sanctuary is ruled by those who mistake stillness for weakness and silence for an invitation to exploit? What happens when they push too far? Elara Vance slipped into the township of Pine Creek, Montana, with the subtlety of an autumn leaf detaching from its branch, a gentle drift, unnoticed by most, certainly unremarked. Her vehicle, a 10-year-old sedan whose once proud sapphire paint had dulled to the shade of a stormy twilight, blended seamlessly with the other slightly weathered cars that lined Main Street. She herself was a study in deliberate unobtrusiveness. Her attire consisted of practical jeans, sturdy walking boots, and a simple, dark-colored jacket that concealed more than it revealed. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was usually tied back, and her face, though possessing a certain striking quality, if one looked closely at the intelligent gray eyes and the firm set of her jaw, was most often composed in an expression of thoughtful neutrality. She had chosen Pine Creek for its advertised tranquility, its location nestled deep within a valley carved by ancient glaciers, surrounded by towering forests that promised solitude. She'd read the brochures, seen the idyllic photographs online, and felt it might be a place to temporarily shed the immense weight of a life lived in shadows and high stakes, a place to simply breathe. There were, of course, other, less advertised reasons for her presence. Whispers that had reached ears they weren't meant for, faint signals of unease emanating from this picturesque on the map. But primarily, she sought a respite, a period of quiet observation before deciding on her next move regarding those faint signals. She rented a small, secluded cabin on the outskirts of town, one overlooking a swift-moving river, its constant murmur a soothing counterpoint to the silence she craved. The locals, those she encountered in the town's single grocery store or the dusty hardware shop, saw a woman who kept to herself, polite but reserved. Some might have thought her a writer seeking inspiration, or perhaps an artist. None, in their wildest imaginings, would have guessed the truth of her identity, or the formidable capabilities veiled by her quiet demeanor. Her eyes, though, missed little. The way Sheriff Rex Thorne, a man whose portly frame seemed perpetually stuffed into a too-tight uniform, carried himself with an air of unearned regality. The swagger of his two most visible deputies, Dale Bulldog Brannigan, a thick-necked man with eyes that seemed to constantly rove for weakness, and Mikey Weasel Sims, slighter of build, but possessing a sneering cruelty that he seemed to relish directing at those he perceived as beneath him. Elara noted their interactions. The way Thorne would clap Brannigan on the back after a particularly overbearing display of authority towards a nervous-looking tourist, the dismissive wave Sims would give to an elderly resident trying to ask a question. She saw the forced congeniality of some shopkeepers when the officers entered, a tension that belied the easy smiles. She noticed the state-of-the-art cruisers the department drove, gleaming and new, contrasting sharply with the worn-out infrastructure of the town hall itself. There were subtle visual clues about Elara, too, had anyone been trained to look. A faint, silvery scar that traced a delicate line just above her left eyebrow, almost hidden by her hair, speaking of a past far removed from quiet cabins. The way her gaze, even when seemingly casual, would subtly scan exits and assess potential threats in any new environment, a habit ingrained so deeply it was almost subconscious. The economy of her movements, precise and controlled, even when simply placing groceries into a bag. These were the hallmarks of a life spent in disciplined, high-stakes environments, invisible to the untrained eye, but screaming volumes to those who knew the language of quiet professionals. Pine Creek was, on its surface, charming. But Elara Vance had learned long ago that surfaces were often deceptive, and the deepest currents of a place were rarely visible from the shore. She intended to observe those currents, initially from a distance, unaware that the currents themselves were about to surge and attempt to pull her under. The inciting incident, when it came, was not dramatic in its initial presentation, but rather a slow, insidious creep of arrogance meeting unyielding, quiet strength. Elara had been in Pine Creek for a little over 2 weeks, establishing a quiet routine. Early morning walks by the river, afternoons spent reading or tending to the small, neglected garden behind her cabin, and occasional trips into town for supplies. She made a point of being unremarkable, of offering no friction. It was during one such trip that she witnessed something that pricked at her carefully cultivated neutrality. She was browsing the sparse selection of books in the general store when she saw Deputy Brannigan and Deputy Sims corner a young man, barely out of his teens, who worked at the local garage. His name, she'd learned from a brief, polite chat with the store owner, was Billy, a good kid saving up for college. Brannigan was towering over Billy, his voice a low growl, while Sims flanked the boy, a smirk playing on his lips. The exchange was muted, but the body language was clear: intimidation. Billy's shoulders were hunched, his face pale. He kept shaking his head, his voice a desperate whisper. Elara couldn't hear the specifics, but the tenor was unmistakable. After a few tense minutes, Brannigan roughly clapped Billy on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a shove, and the two deputies sauntered out, laughing. Billy remained frozen for a moment, then quickly hurried out the back of the store, his face etched with fear and humiliation. Elara purchased her items, her expression unchanging, but her internal calculus had shifted. This was not just boorishness, this was predatory. Later that day, Elara found her own car, parked perfectly legally on a quiet side street, adorned with a parking ticket. The infraction cited was obstructing a non-existent driveway, a clear fabrication. She examined the ticket, her lips a thin line. It was Brannigan's signature at the bottom. This was a probe, a petty display of power. She paid the fine without comment at the small municipal office the next day, handing the exact cash to a bored-looking clerk. Her lack of protest seemed to only pique their interest. A few days later, she was pulled over by Sims as she drove back from a hike. The supposed reason: her taillight was out. Elara knew, for a fact, it wasn't. She did a thorough check of her vehicle every morning, a habit from a life where mechanical failure could have catastrophic consequences. "License and registration, ma'am," Sims drawled, leaning into her window, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting her own impassive face. He exuded a cheap cologne and an aura of self-importance. Elara provided the documents. He took an inordinate amount of time examining them, then handed them back. "Taillights flickering. Best get that fixed. Wouldn't want you to be a danger to our good citizens." His tone was condescending, a verbal pat on the head. "Thank you, officer," Elara replied, her voice level, devoid of any discernible emotion. "I'll have it checked immediately." She drove away, and in her rearview mirror, she saw Sims watching her, a smug look on his face. He hadn't even bothered to pretend to write a ticket that time. It was pure harassment. The message was clear: "We see you, outsider." We can touch you whenever we want. Chief Rex Thorne himself made an appearance during her next random stop, this time for allegedly rolling through a stop sign she was certain she had come to a complete halt for. Thorne, all bluster and feigned paternal concern, leaned against her car door after Brannigan had taken her license. "Ma'am, we're on a tight ship here in Pine Creek. We expect folks to respect our laws. You seem to be having a bit of trouble adjusting." His eyes, small and shrewd, assessed her. "Not from the city, are you? Things are a bit different out here." Elara met his gaze. "I understand, Chief. I endeavored to be a law-abiding individual." Her voice was calm, polite, but there was an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. Not fear, certainly, but a kind of quiet resilience that seemed to absorb his intimidation tactics without yielding. "See that you do," Thorne grunted, pushing himself off her car. "We don't like trouble here." Internally, Elara was a whirlwind of cold analysis. She cataloged their tactics, their personalities, the clear collusion. Brannigan, the muscle, driven by a brutish need for dominance. Sims, the weasel, enjoying the petty sadism. Thorne, the kingpin, bloated by his perceived power, protective of his small, corrupt domain. They were predictable, and that, Elara knew, was always a critical weakness. She was not just some tourist to be easily cowed. They had no idea who they were prodding. They were poking a bear that had slumbered, not died, and their arrogance was steadily, surely, waking it up. The weeks that followed saw a steady, calculated escalation of harassment against Elara. It was as if her quiet endurance, her refusal to be visibly rattled, was a personal affront to Chief Thorne and his favored deputies. The parking tickets became more frequent for increasingly ludicrous reasons. Vehicle facing wrong direction on a one-way street. It was a two-way street. Tires too close to the curb. Improperly displayed air freshener. Each was a minor annoyance, a pinprick, but the cumulative effect was intended to be draining, to make her feel unwelcome, watched, and powerless. Then came the more overt acts. Her garbage bins, left out for collection as per the town schedule, were accidentally knocked over multiple times, their contents strewn across her small yard. Always on days Brannigan's cruiser was seen patrolling her remote road. Twice, she returned to her cabin to find the gate to her property, which she always latched, swinging open. Nothing was ever taken, nothing overtly disturbed inside. But the message was clear: we can get to you. We can invade your space. Elara documented everything with meticulous, almost clinical precision. Dates, times, the nature of the harassment, the officers involved if seen. She took discreet photographs on a small, high-resolution camera. The overturned bins with Brannigan's cruiser passing in the distance. The illegally parked police vehicle that sat outside her cabin for an hour one night, with its headlights off. She recorded snippets of their condescending remarks on a tiny digital recorder during traffic stops. Her training, honed over years in environments where accurate intelligence was the difference between life and death, kicked in. She was no longer just observing the town's general malaise. She was building a case, though her initial intent was merely self-preservation, perhaps a quiet word to an old contact in a federal agency if things got too out of hand. She was still hoping to resolve this locally, or for them to simply tire of their game. The townsfolk, for the most part, kept their distance. She saw the sympathy in some eyes. Mrs. Henderson at the bakery, who always gave her an extra cookie. Mr. Abernathy at the hardware store, who offered a quiet word of advice on fixing a leaky faucet. But also the fear. They knew the nature of Thorne's regime. No one openly challenged him or his men. Elara became a pariah by association. The troublemaker the police were so diligently keeping an eye on. She understood their silence. It was the silence of people who felt trapped, who had learned that speaking out only brought more trouble. Her isolation was palpable. There were no friends to call upon locally, no allies to stand with her. This was a battle she would have to fight or endure alone. During this period, Elara's quiet resilience was her most potent shield. She met each act of petty tyranny with the same calm demeanor. She paid the fines promptly. She cleaned up the messes without complaint. She fixed her gate. Outwardly, she gave him nothing. No anger, no fear, no satisfaction. Internally, however, a cold, hard anger was beginning to solidify. It wasn't the explosive anger of a cornered animal, but the focused, controlled fury of a master strategist whose patience was being deliberately tested. Her motivations were shifting from simply wanting peace to a growing resolve that these men, who abused their power so casually, who preyed on the vulnerable, needed to be stopped. Not just for her own sake, but for the sake of people like young Billy, for the Mrs. Hendersons and Mr. Abernathy's who lived under this quiet reign of terror. Late at night, in the secure confines of her cabin, the unassuming facade would drop. The soft glow of a heavily encrypted laptop would illuminate her face, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed, accessing secure servers, sending coded messages, and cross-referencing information. The whispers about Pine Creek she'd initially dismissed were now being examined with far greater scrutiny, connected to her own first-hand experiences. She was leveraging resources they couldn't even fathom. The image of the quiet, slightly lost-looking woman was a carefully constructed illusion, and beneath it, the gears of a formidable intellect and a powerful organization were beginning to turn, slowly, silently, but with undeniable purpose. The deputies, in their arrogance, saw only what they wanted to see: a lone woman, an easy target. They had no idea they were systematically antagonizing one of an apex predator in a world they didn't even know existed. The antagonists in Pine Creek, Chief Rex Thorne and his loyal enforcers, Brannigan and Sims, were not accustomed to resistance, especially not the quiet, unyielding kind Elara Vance presented. Her stoicism, her refusal to break or flee, gnawed at their inflated egos. They had expected tears, pleas, or at the very least, angry outbursts that would give them justification for further action. Instead, they got polite compliance on the surface and an infuriating calmness that seemed to mock their authority. Thorne, in particular, felt his control of the town subtly challenged by this one woman who wouldn't cower. Their campaign of petty harassment hadn't yielded the desired result. So they decided to escalate, to lay a trap so undeniable, so public, that she would be crushed and their dominance reaffirmed for all of Pine Creek to witness. Their plan began to coalesce during one of their late-night strategy sessions at the back booth of a local diner, fueled by lukewarm coffee and shared resentment. "She thinks she's smart, that one," Brannigan grumbled, stirring his coffee with unnecessary force. "Too quiet. It ain't natural." Sims, ever the eager subordinate, chimed in, "Yeah, Chief. Like she's looking down on us. We need to show her who's boss around here, once and for all." Thorne, leaning back, a toothpick working at the corner of his mouth, nodded slowly. He'd been mulling it over. The usual tactics weren't working. They needed something more concrete, something that would stick, something that would allow them to drag her through the mud publicly. "We need something that can't be argued away," Thorne said, his eyes narrowing. "Something that puts her firmly on the wrong side of the law. No ambiguity." The opportunity presented itself a few days later, almost as if on cue for their nefarious designs. A minor fender bender occurred in the town square. A distracted tourist had backed into a parked car. It was a routine incident, but Brannigan and Sims were the responding officers. Elara happened to be walking by, returning from the post office, an innocent bystander among a few others. As Brannigan was taking statements, he noticed Elara. He made a show of calling her over. "Ma'am, did you see what happened here?" Elara, truthful as always, stated she had not witnessed the actual impact, only the immediate aftermath. This, perversely, became the seed of their plan. Later that evening, as Elara was driving back to her cabin, just as dusk was settling, she saw flashing lights in her rearview mirror. It was Brannigan and Sims again. They pulled her over on a deserted stretch of road. This time, their demeanor was different, less mocking, more overtly aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Brannigan ordered, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Elara complied, her senses on high alert. "There've been a hit-and-run reported matching your vehicle's description," Sims announced, a triumphant glint in his eye. "Witnesses saw you fleeing the scene of an accident downtown earlier." "That's incorrect, officer," Elara stated calmly. I was present after an accident, but I was not involved, nor did I flee any scene. Oh, we have witnesses who say otherwise, Brannigan sneered. And looky here. He walked to the front of her car, then knelt down, pretending to inspect something. He found a fresh scratch and a smear of paint on her bumper that hadn't been there that morning. Paint that suspiciously matched the car involved in the earlier fender bender. It was a crude, obvious plant, but in the dim light, under their aggressive posturing, they clearly believed it was enough. Resisting arrest, fleeing the scene, property damage. You're in a whole heap of trouble, lady, Sims said, pulling out handcuffs. Elara didn't resist physically. She knew that would only play into their hands, give them the excuse they craved for violence. But her mind was racing, documenting every word, every action. This was no longer petty harassment. This was a deliberate, malicious frame-up. They cuffed her a little too tightly and shoved her into the back of their cruiser with unnecessary force. Chief Thorne was waiting at the station, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Well, Ms. Vance, he said, almost purring. Looks like your little vacation in Pine Creek has come to an unfortunate end. We tried to warn you about respecting our laws. He personally oversaw her booking, fingerprinting, mugshots, the whole demeaning process. They made sure to parade her past the holding cell where young Billy, the garage mechanic, was currently detained on some other trumped-up charge, a clear message within a message. Elara met Billy's frightened gaze with a steady, almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise that this injustice would not stand. The trap had been sprung. They thought they had her. They were already envisioning the courtroom, the quick conviction, the public humiliation of this outsider who dared to defy their unwritten rules. They were celebrating their cleverness, their absolute power in their little kingdom. What they failed to realize was that they hadn't just trapped Elara Vance. They had cornered a creature far more dangerous than they could comprehend, and in doing so, had irrevocably sealed their own fate. The quiet woman was now fully awake, and the process of her vindication, though not yet visible to them, had already begun. The Pine Creek Courthouse was a modest, slightly dilapidated building, its stone steps worn smooth by generations of townsfolk seeking justice, or, as was often the case under Chief Thorne's influence, witnessing its perversion. On the day of Elara Vance's arraignment, the small courtroom was more packed than usual. Word had spread, carefully curated by Thorne and his men, that the troublesome outsider woman was finally getting her comeuppance. Brannigan and Sims were present, of course, looking smug and self-important in freshly pressed uniforms, whispering to other officers and a few supportive locals who formed their mocking chorus. They were the heroes of the hour, having apprehended a dangerous fugitive. Chief Thorne himself sat in the front row of the public gallery, exuding an air of grave authority, though a keen observer might have noticed the slight smirk playing on his lips. He was anticipating a swift, satisfying victory. The judge assigned to the case was Judge Arthur Hemlock, a man whose judicial robe seemed a size too large for his shrunken frame, and whose loyalty to Thorne was an open secret in Pine Creek. He peered down from the bench through thick spectacles, an expression of weary impatience already settling on his face. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named Marcus Finch, who owed his position largely to Thorne's patronage, bustled about with an air of confidence, shuffling papers he barely seemed to consult. Elara was brought in, still in the clothes she'd been arrested in the previous night, looking tired but composed. Her usual quietude was intact, but now it seemed to have a different quality, not of submission, but of profound, almost unnerving stillness. A public defender, a harried, middle-aged man named Ben Carter, was assigned to her. Carter approached her with a sigh, his shoulders slumped. "Ms. Vance," he said in a low voice, "look, the evidence they claim to have is, well, in this town it's usually best to plead guilty to a lesser charge, pay a fine, and get out. Fighting this will just make it worse." His tone was one of complete resignation, a man long accustomed to the futility of challenging Thorne's machine. Elara looked at him, her gray eyes surprisingly direct. "Thank you for your counsel, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft but firm. "However, I will not be pleading guilty to charges I am innocent of. For now, I will observe the proceedings. I may choose to represent myself, or I may inform the court that my own counsel is on its way and request a continuance." Carter blinked, taken aback. This was not the reaction he expected. Most people in her situation were terrified, desperate. He saw the amusement in the eyes of Brannigan and Sims as they overheard Elara's quiet defiance. He simply shrugged, a gesture of "suit yourself," and retreated to his seat. The proceedings began. Prosecutor Finch laid out the charges with dramatic flair. Fleeing the scene of an accident, resisting arrest, a charge added when Elara had calmly questioned the legality of their stop on that deserted road, and property damage. He painted Elara as a reckless, disrespectful individual who had shown contempt for the laws and officers of Pine Creek. His voice dripped with sanctimony. Deputy Brannigan was called as the first witness. He swaggered to the stand, took the oath with a smirk, and launched into his well-rehearsed testimony. He described Elara speeding away from the accident scene, her shifty behavior when questioned, and the incriminating damage on her vehicle. He embellished, he lied, he postured, all under the approving gaze of Chief Thorne and the encouraging nods of Judge Hemlock. Deputy Sims followed, corroborating Brannigan's every word, adding his own colorful, fabricated details about Elara's supposed aggressive attitude. The two of them painted a picture of a defiant, guilty woman caught red-handed by brave, diligent officers. Throughout their testimony, Elara remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. Occasionally, her gaze would flick towards Thorne, then to Hemlock, then back to the testifying officer. It was a gaze of pure, unnerving observation, as if she were committing every lie, every nuance of their performance, to an indelible mental archive. The mocking chorus in the gallery tittered at some of Brannigan's more outrageous claims. The atmosphere in the courtroom was one of a foregone conclusion, a show trial designed to publicly humiliate Elara and reinforce the absolute authority of Thorne's regime. Prosecutor Finch rested his case with a flourish, looking expectantly at Judge Hemlock, confident of a swift ruling. Judge Hemlock adjusted his spectacles. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice tinged with impatience, "you've heard the compelling testimony from these fine officers. Do you have anything to say before this court proceeds to judgment? Or will you finally accept Mr. Carter's earlier, wise counsel?" He clearly expected a mumbled denial or a tearful plea. The entire courtroom leaned in, anticipating the final act of this small-town drama. This was the catalytic event, the stage carefully set by her antagonists for her downfall. They had no inkling that Elara Vance was about to rewrite the entire script. Judge Hemlock's question hung in the stale air of the Pine Creek courtroom, a rhetorical flourish before what he and everyone else in Thorne's pocket expected to be a swift and damning judgment. The snickers from the back benches had subsided into an anticipatory hush. Chief Thorne leaned forward slightly, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Brannigan and Sims exchanged self-congratulatory smirks. This was their moment of triumph, the culmination of their efforts to break the quiet woman. Elara Vance rose slowly from her seat at the defendant's table. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. The weariness that had clung to her seemed to dissipate, replaced by an almost palpable aura of contained energy. The quietness was still there, but it was no longer the quietness of a potential victim. It was the profound stillness before a storm. "Your Honor," she began, her voice surprisingly clear and steady, resonating through the courtroom with an unexpected authority that cut through the prior smugness. It wasn't loud, but commanded attention. Every eye was on her. "Before we proceed to any judgment, there are several significant inaccuracies in the testimony provided, and indeed, a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation at hand that needs to be addressed." A ripple of surprise went through the courtroom. This was not the response they had anticipated. Judge Hemlock frowned. "Ms. Vance, this is not the time for lengthy speeches. The evidence is quite clear. With all due respect, Your Honor," Elara continued, her gaze unwavering, the evidence as presented is far from clear. For instance, Deputy Brannigan testified that he observed my vehicle from a distance of approximately 50 yards and identified a fresh scratch mark. Given the failing light conditions at 1937 hours last evening, the specific particulate matter in the air from the local lumber mill, and the precise angle of his supposed observation relative to the limited ambient light from the distant street lamp on Elm Street, a Class 3 visual identification of a minor paint abrasion of less than 3 centimeters, as he described, would be highly improbable without optical aid, which he did not claim to use. Furthermore, the paint sample allegedly found on my vehicle, which I have not yet been allowed to see an analysis report for, would require immediate spectrographic comparison to the alleged victim vehicle to establish any definitive link, a procedure I highly doubt was conducted with any integrity, if at all, overnight in Pine Creek's limited facilities. The sheer technical precision of her statement, the unexpected jargon, stunned the courtroom into silence. Brannigan's smirk faltered. Prosecutor Finch looked momentarily bewildered. Even Judge Hemlock seemed taken aback by the authoritative tone and the detailed rebuttal. This was not the rambling of a desperate woman. This was something else entirely. Elara paused, letting her words sink in. Then she delivered the blow. However, Your Honor, these procedural and factual discrepancies, while significant, are secondary to a much larger issue. There's a matter of jurisdiction, and indeed, a significant conflict of interest that this court, and specifically Chief Thorne and his deputies, seem to be entirely unaware of. And it is for that reason that their actions against me constitute not just a miscarriage of justice, but a serious federal offense. Chief Thorne stiffened in his seat. Brannigan and Sims exchanged uneasy glances. "What are you insinuating, Ms. Vance?" Judge Hemlock demanded, his voice losing some of its earlier condescension. Elara's gaze swept over Thorne, Brannigan, and Sims, cold and appraising. Then, she looked directly at Judge Hemlock. "I'm not insinuating, Your Honor. I'm stating a fact." She reached into the simple, worn bag she'd been allowed to keep, a bag they'd cursorily searched and dismissed. From it, she withdrew a slim, unassuming leather case. She opened it. "My name is Elara Vance, and I am the current director of the Central Intelligence Agency." She held up the open case, revealing the official, gold-embossed credentials. A collective gasp, a wave of utter disbelief, rippled through the courtroom. Thorne's face, moments before smug, went slack, then turned a mottled shade of red and white. Brannigan's jaw literally dropped, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Sims looked as if he might faint. Prosecutor Finch stared aghast. Even Judge Hemlock seemed to shrink in his chair, his spectacles slipping down his nose. The mocking chorus in the gallery was utterly silent, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning fear. "My presence in Pine Creek," Elara continued, her voice calm, but now imbued with the full weight of her office, "was initially for personal reasons, but also to make some discreet, preliminary observations regarding certain irregularities that had been reported through tangential channels." Chief Thorne, Deputies Brannigan and Sims, through their sustained campaign of harassment, intimidation, and culminating in this fabricated arrest and malicious prosecution, have not only violated my civil rights, but have also actively interfered with a federal officer in the potential observation of matters that could fall under national security purview, given the reports of certain cross-border activities linked to this region. Their actions today, and in the preceding weeks, will now be subject to a full federal investigation. Just as she finished speaking, the main doors of the courtroom swung open with decisive force. The sudden opening of the courtroom doors amplified the stunned silence that had fallen after Elara Vance's earth-shattering revelation. Into the room strode 3 individuals who radiated an entirely different kind of authority than the blustering power chief Thorne and his men had wielded. They were dressed in dark, conservative suits, their expressions grim and professional, their eyes sharp and missing nothing. The lead figure, a tall man with silvering temples and an air of quiet command, surveyed the scene briefly before his gaze settled on Elara. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "Director Vance," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of federal authority. "Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI. We received your communication. Apologies for the slight delay. Coordinating with the local U.S. Attorney's Office took a moment." The use of Thorne in the FBI agent's name with a bitter irony that was not lost on the now-panicked Pine Creek police chief. Chief Rex Thorne looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His face was ashen, his bravado utterly extinguished, replaced by a rapidly dawning terror. Deputies Brannigan and Sims were frozen, their faces masks of disbelief and raw fear. Brannigan, who moments before had been swaggering on the witness stand, now seemed to be trying to make himself smaller, to melt into the woodwork. Sims was visibly trembling. Judge Hemlock, his face pale and beaded with sweat, stammered, "FBI? What is the meaning of this? This is a local matter, a simple misunderstanding." "Special Agent Thorne, the FBI one," fixed Judge Hemlock with a cold stare. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this misunderstanding involves the false arrest, malicious prosecution, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of her civil rights. A citizen who also happens to be a senior official of the United States government. It has escalated far beyond a local matter. We will be taking jurisdiction." He then turned his attention to Chief Rex Thorne, Brannigan, and Sims. "Chief Thorne, Deputy Brannigan, Deputy Sims, you are hereby informed that you are the subjects of a federal investigation into corruption, abuse of power, conspiracy, and multiple civil rights violations. You will surrender your badges and service weapons immediately. You are to make no statements and contact no one until you have spoken with federal investigators." Two other agents fanned out, their presence an unspoken threat, effectively sealing the room. The local officers who had formed part of the mocking chorus now looked terrified, desperately trying to disassociate themselves from their colleagues. Elara Vance, her composure absolute, addressed the FBI agent. "Agent Thorne, thank you for your prompt arrival. I have been documenting the activities of these individuals for several weeks. Their harassment has been systematic. The charges against me today are entirely fabricated. The supposed evidence of a hit-and-run was planted on my vehicle by Deputies Brannigan and Sims. I have preliminary forensic evidence, including time-stamped photographs and audio recordings, to support my claims." Her voice was precise, factual, devoid of triumph, yet each word was a hammer blow to the crumbling edifice of Thorne's corrupt regime. She then turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces in the gallery. "For those of you who live in Pine Creek," she said, her voice softening fractionally but still carrying immense authority, "I understand that speaking out against entrenched power can be difficult, even dangerous. What you have witnessed today is the beginning of a process to restore integrity and true justice to this town. Those who have abused their positions will be held accountable." Chief Thorne finally found his voice, a desperate, blustering croak. "This is outrageous. A setup. She's lying. I'm the chief of police here." Special Agent Thorne cut him off sharply. "You were the chief of police, Mr. Thorne. Your authority in that capacity is now suspended pending the outcome of our investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully. It will be in your best interest." Brannigan, his face a mask of terror, began to babble. I was just following orders. The chief, he told us she was suspicious." Sims just whimpered, looking from Thorne to Brannigan to the impassive FBI agents like a trapped animal. Prosecutor Marcus Finch, who had been slowly backing away towards the wall, now looked as if he wanted the earth to swallow him. Judge Hemlock, seeing his own complicity about to be exposed, began to wring his hands. "I had no idea of any of this. I was merely presiding." The immediate fallout was swift and brutal. The FBI agents, with practiced efficiency, began the process of securing the courtroom, directing local, unaffiliated bailiffs to collect the badges and weapons from Thorne, Brannigan, and Sims. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the stark, humiliating reality of their downfall. The once feared figures of Pine Creek were now just scared men, stripped of their power in an instant, their world collapsing around them because they had underestimated, mocked, and systematically targeted one quiet woman who happened to be the director of the CIA. The taste of victory for Elara was not one of glee, but of grim satisfaction. Justice, long delayed for the people of Pine Creek, was finally, inexorably, beginning to unfold. The arrest and public unmasking of Chief Rex Thorne, Deputies Brannigan and Sims, and the palpable fear radiating from Judge Hemlock and Prosecutor Finch sent shockwaves through Pine Creek that resonated far beyond the confines of its small courtroom. As the federal agents methodically took control, Thorne, Brannigan, and Sims were formally detained, read their Miranda rights in stunned, humiliating silence, and escorted out of the courthouse, not as enforcers of the law, but as prisoners of it. Their swagger was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and the vacant stares of men whose worlds had just imploded. The crowd that had gathered to witness Elara's expected downfall now watched in stunned amazement, then a dawning, almost fearful elation, as the architects of their local tyranny were led away in handcuffs. Whispers turned into excited murmurs, then outright chatter as the implications began to sink in. The untouchables had been touched, brought down by the very woman they had sought to crush. Judge Hemlock, after a tense, private conversation with Special Agent Thorne and a senior attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office who had arrived with the FBI team, was formally suspended from the bench pending investigation into his judicial conduct and complicity. Prosecutor Finch, similarly, found his burgeoning career in smoldering ruins, informed that his actions would be subject to a Bar Association review and potential criminal charges. The edifice of corruption that had seemed so unshakable just hours before was crumbling with breathtaking speed. Elara Vance remained the calm center of the storm. Once the initial arrests were made, she conferred quietly with Special Agent Thorne, providing him with a secure data stick containing her meticulously gathered evidence. The photographs, the audio recordings, the detailed logs of harassment, financial irregularities she had begun to uncover regarding town contracts and seized property auctions, and even satellite imagery cross-referenced with local land registry data that hinted at undeclared assets held by Thorne. Her professionalism was absolute. There was no hint of personal vendetta, only a commitment to thoroughness and fact. The initial scope of my interest here was narrow. Agent Thorne, she explained in a low voice, away from prying ears. Reports of unusual logistical movements in this region, possibly facilitating unauthorized cross-border transit of sensitive materials. Chief Thorne's enthusiastic attempts to intimidate me inadvertently drew my attention to the depth of the local systemic corruption. It seems he and his associates were running a fairly comprehensive extortion and intimidation racket, quite aside from any larger concerns. Agent Thorne nodded grimly. Your preliminary work will save us months, Director. We had some low-level intelligence on Pine Creek, but nothing actionable until now. Your direct experience and documentation provide the keystone. News of the CIA director being personally involved in taking down a corrupt small-town police force spread like wildfire, first through Montana, then nationally. Pine Creek, once an anonymous dot on the map, was suddenly thrust into the media spotlight. Reporters began to descend on the town, eager for details of the quiet woman who toppled the kingpin. Elara, true to her nature, shunned the media attention, deferring all queries to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. She had no interest in personal glory. Her aim had been justice and the dismantling of a corrupt system that preyed on the vulnerable. Many townsfolk who had previously been too afraid to speak out began to tentatively approach the federal investigators. Stories of shakedowns, false arrests, and petty cruelties that had been endured in silence for years started to surface. Young Billy, the garage mechanic, was quickly released from his unjust detention, his face a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude when he learned who Elara truly was and what she had done. He became one of the first to give a detailed statement about the constant harassment and extortion he and his family's small business had faced from Thorne's men. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, who had shown Elara small kindnesses, wept with relief. Mr. Abernathy from the hardware store shook his head in amazement, muttering about how you could never judge a book by its cover. The skeptics and mockers, those who had eagerly anticipated Elara's public humiliation, were now either deeply ashamed or terrified of their own past associations with Thorne's crew. Some even attempted to offer belated apologies or expressions of admiration to Elara, but she accepted them with a cool, polite detachment. Her focus was on ensuring the mechanisms for lasting change were put in place. The immediate aftermath was chaotic but cathartic. The fear that had gripped Pine Creek was beginning to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Elara Vance, the unassuming woman who had sought peace, had instead brought a reckoning. And in doing so, she had given the town a chance to reclaim its soul. The federal investigation into Pine Creek's entrenched corruption, spearheaded by the FBI and armed with Elara Vance's damning initial evidence, quickly deepened and widened. It was like turning over a large, flat rock in a damp forest. The underside teemed with an unpleasant variety of crawling, hidden life. Chief Thorne's regime, it turned out, was even more rotten than Elara had initially suspected. It wasn't just petty shakedowns and abuse of power. There were tendrils reaching into local businesses, rigged town contracts, suspicious land deals, and even evidence suggesting Thorne might have been turning a blind eye to, or perhaps even facilitating, minor smuggling operations through the remote wilderness areas surrounding Pine Creek, which tied back to Elara's initial, peripheral concerns that had drawn her to the region in a low-key observational capacity. More arrests followed. Several other officers from the Pine Creek Police Department, who had been complicit in Thorne's schemes or had actively participated in the culture of intimidation, were either indicted or forced to resign in disgrace. Town council members who had benefited from Thorne's patronage found themselves under scrutiny. The initially complicit/weak authority figures, like the court clerk who had processed Elara's bogus tickets with such indifference, were interviewed, and some faced disciplinary action for their roles in enabling the corrupt system. The legal proceedings against Thorne, Brannigan, and Sims were swift by federal standards, given the overwhelming evidence, much of it meticulously documented by Elara herself. Their arrogant courtroom demeanor was long gone, replaced by the grim reality of facing serious federal charges. Brannigan, in a desperate attempt to save himself, tried to cut a deal, offering to testify against Thorne, painting himself as a reluctant underling. Sims, predictably, broke down completely, confessing to everything and implicating everyone above him. Thorne, however, remained defiant, clinging to a delusional belief that his connections would somehow save him, until the very end when a jury found him guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and extortion. He received a lengthy prison sentence, a stark and ignominious end to his reign as Pine Creek's petty tyrant. Brannigan and Sims received lesser, though still substantial, sentences for their roles. Judge Hemlock, facing impeachment and disbarment, chose to resign in disgrace, pleading guilty to obstruction of justice to avoid a more severe outcome. Prosecutor Finch saw his legal career end before it had truly begun, accepting a plea bargain that involved surrendering his law license and performing extensive community service, forever tainted by his association with the Pine Creek scandal. With the corrupt elements purged, the task of rebuilding began. The Department of Justice, in consultation with state authorities and with discreet, informal input from Elara, helped to appoint an interim police chief, a seasoned, respected officer from outside the county, known for her integrity and commitment to community policing. New training protocols were implemented for the remaining and newly hired officers. Town meetings were held, allowing residents to voice their concerns and participate in shaping the future of their local law enforcement. It was a slow, arduous process, but the seeds of genuine reform were sown. Elara Vance, true to her word, did not seek the limelight. She provided her formal deposition to the federal investigators, her testimony precise, factual, and devastatingly effective. She then quietly prepared to leave Pine Creek. Her initial quest for a peaceful retreat had been spectacularly derailed, But in its place, she had accomplished something far more significant. She had acted as a catalyst for profound, positive systemic change. She had demonstrated that one person, armed with integrity, quiet strength, and formidable, albeit hidden, capabilities, could indeed dismantle a corrupt power structure. Before she left, she had a quiet cup of coffee with Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Abernathy, and even shared a brief, encouraging word with young Billy, who was now talking about studying law. These were small gestures, but they signified the human connection that had, in its own way, fueled her resolve. She didn't see herself as a hero, merely as someone who had done what was necessary when confronted with blatant injustice. The legacy she left behind was not a statue or a plaque, but a town slowly healing, a community learning to trust again, and a powerful, enduring lesson about the fallacy of judging by appearances and the silent strength that can move mountains, or at least topple corrupt chiefs of police. Her work was far from over. The world was full of shadows and threats that required her unique skills. Pine Creek had been an unexpected detour, but a meaningful one. As the dust settled over Pine Creek and the machinery of federal justice ground inexorably onward, the thematic resonance of Elara Vance's unwilling intervention became clearer. Her story was a potent reminder that true strength often resides not in loud proclamations or ostentatious displays of power, but in quiet resilience, meticulous preparation, and unwavering integrity. The arrogant gatekeepers, Thorne and his cronies, had built their kingdom on fear and superficial authority. They judged Elara by her unassuming appearance, her quiet demeanor, her older car, all the superficial markers they valued, and in doing so, they profoundly miscalculated. Their downfall was a direct consequence of their own hubris, their inability to see beyond the surface. Elara, the quiet professional, the hidden master, embodied the antithesis of their crass and bullying style. Her power was not derived from a badge or a uniform carelessly wielded, but from years of disciplined training, a sharp intellect, a strong moral compass, and access to resources they couldn't even imagine. She endured their mockery and sabotage with stoic patience, not out of weakness, but because she was observing, gathering, and choosing her moment. When that moment came in the courtroom, her reveal was not an emotional outburst, but a calm, factual, and utterly devastating presentation of truth backed by undeniable authority. The emotional arc for the town of Pine Creek, and indeed for anyone hearing this story, mirrored Elara's journey. It began with a sense of unease and frustration at the antagonist's behavior, building through tension as Elara was unfairly targeted. The climax in the courtroom delivered a powerful surge of vindication and satisfaction, as the tables were so dramatically turned. The resolution brought a sense of hope, justice affirmed, and an uplifting belief in the possibility of positive change, even against entrenched corruption. The antagonists, for their part, served as stark examples of poetic justice. Thorne, stripped of his power and facing a long prison sentence, was reportedly a broken man, his arrogance shattered by the stark reality of his confinement. Brannigan and Sims, their bullying personas deflated, were left to contemplate their foolishness and cruelty in their own prison cells. There was little sign of genuine remorse from the core culprits, only the bitterness of defeat. However, some of the lesser involvement, those who had been part of the mocking chorus or had enabled Thorne through fear or apathy, did express a newfound respect for Elara and a sense of shame for their own prior conduct or inaction, which was, in itself, a small step towards communal healing. Before her final departure from Pine Creek, Elara met briefly with a newly appointed interim police chief, sharing some observations on community trust-building strategies she had seen implemented effectively in other post-conflict or transitional environments around the world, albeit on a much grander scale. She also had a final, discreet conversation with Agent Thorne of the FBI, ensuring that the broader security concerns that had initially drawn her to the periphery of Pine Creek were being adequately addressed now that the local interference was removed. Her own work, The vast and silent responsibilities of leading the CIA called her back to Washington. She left Pine Creek as quietly as she had arrived. There were no farewell parades, no public acknowledgments at her request. She slipped away in her unremarkable sedan, leaving behind a town irrevocably changed, a town that had learned a profound lesson about underestimation. The narrator of this tale, much like Elara herself, seeks to leave you with more than just a dramatic story. It's an invitation to look closer, to listen more carefully, to question your own snap judgments. How many Elara Vance walk among us? Their extraordinary capabilities hidden beneath an ordinary exterior. How often do we dismiss quiet strength or mistake patience for weakness? The world is full of individuals whose true worth is not immediately apparent. Perhaps you've witnessed such a vindication yourself, or been the underestimated party. The core message is one of empowerment, that integrity, skill, and quiet resolve can be formidable weapons against arrogance and injustice. Remember Pine Creek. Remember Elara Vance. And perhaps look at the world and the people in it with a little more insight, a little less assumption, and a lot more respect for the depths that may lie beneath a still surface. For it is often in the quietest waters that the strongest currents flow, capable of reshaping landscapes and, indeed, lives.